Hello, so today we're going to be talking about line selection as well as committing to a comp, really fundamental aspects of TFT that are very important. This is a very involved topic, so these are going to be more general suggestions with a couple of specific examples to help illustrate the point relevant to the current patch, which is 14.7. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm working on my 10,000 sub goal, which will then do an RP giveaway for all the subscribers. So if we can make it to 10,000 subs before the end of this set, that would be amazing. If you watch my content, I normally do guides and guide style content like this. I also do some for fun stuff, like we've been recently doing some guess who wins, playing Bordle, and some of those type of things. If you like all that style of content, you want to get the most out of your set 14 experience, I definitely recommend you subscribing. So now let's just talk about TFT Success 101 in general. Whenever I talk about TFT and having a successful game of TFT, you'll often need at least two of these three things. You either need HP, where you have a large HP advantage, so you're going to easily place within the top 4. You want Econ, where you're going to have a lot of money in order to hit your board and realize the full potential of your game, either by leveling or hitting the units that you want. Or you want to have board value. So if you've already established, or if you've already used your Econ to establish a strong board, you want to have a board that has a lot of gold invested in it. And usually by the end of the game, you're going to need to have at least two of these three things. Usually at all points of the game, it's something that's really important. This is something that comes up a lot when you're identifying a spot or how strong your position is in any one given game of TFT. So if we're talking about a spot, this is a word a lot of people just use as a general term, like my spot for this comp is good, blah 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 blah. What is a spot? Well, it's just a general term just to describe your position within a game to play a certain comp. So when you're saying my spot for this comp is good, what you're saying is I have the necessary resources and or conditions in order to play that particular comp. So this is affected by everything, right? It's affected by how much HP you have. Some comps do better if you have more HP versus less HP. Depends on your econ. Some comps more expensive, some comps less expensive. Augments, units, items, and the list can go on and on. It can even go as specific as like these particular traits of the units having variance from game to game. Think Exotech. If your Exotech items are good, that can affect your spot to play something like Exotech. So when people say spot, it's just because they don't want to say like all these other things. It's just a shorthand way of saying I think I can play this comp from a decent area of or decent position based on my resources. And when we talk about good spots, obviously that's going to mean you have a better chance to reach stability, right? You have a better chance to actually hit your units, a better chance to hit the things that you need, items, augments, etc. But usually when you talk about having a good spot, what you're saying is, I think that if I play this comp, I will be more stable, or I will reach that point of stability a lot easier, and this is better. This improves my spot for that comp, so I think that I'm in a good spot for that reason. When we talk about stability, it means that you're typically winning most rounds, or you're maintaining your HP position, either by like, let's say you're like, the 4th highest HP in the lobby. If you are stable, you are going to remain or improve that HP position. You're not going to be bleeding out, you're not going to be losing a bunch of HP, and then just losing the game on the spot. It usually means that you're at a point where if things go good or if things go bad, it's not going to directly outcome your final placement in the game, right? You have wiggle room, but at the same time you are at a relative point where you're winning most of those rounds, which is usually what stability refers to. Not winning every round necessarily, but winning most rounds. Now, if we talk about the spots for different comps, we're going to split this presentation that I'm doing into reroll spots as well as forecast spots. Those are the two main strategies in a game. I also want to shout out, if you want to know how to play any particular style of gameplay, I did lots of guides on these for each set, and specifically for this set, I did them a while ago. So if you want to know how to play forecasts, there is a how to play forecast guide on my channel. You just have to search it up. It's there. YouTube, the way it works, doesn't recommend it because it's an older video. And then I also have a how to play rerolls video that you can look at that will teach you all the steps along the way, like when to level, when you use your gold, etc., when you're stable. If you want to know for any one particular comp, I also have a how to play playlist where I go through every single trait in the set. Some of them are a little bit outdated, of course, so I try and make them as future proof as possible, saying, hey, if there's buffs here or buffs here, these are the changes that can happen. So some of them are a little bit outdated, like for example Exotech, that's like 2 months old. Exotech was a lot different 2 months ago. There might be some things in my more recent videos that explain it a little bit better, but for the most part, most of them hold up, is what I would say. But anyways, let's go back to talking about reroll spots, right? So a lot of this is ripped from that presentation, but because you're going for 3-star units when you're rerolling a unit, that's like you're taking a low cost unit, going for a 3-star version of it. You want to have copies of that unit, early items and useful components, and you also want to have good augments that support those 3-star units. Because you're rerolling the unit, you're front loading a lot of your decision making. You're choosing to play around a low cost unit, which means that you have to have those early items and early copies of those units. You cannot give yourself time for things to work out, because the whole point of playing reroll is that you are playing the low cost units, which gives you like an early game HP advantage. That's the whole point of reroll. So your early game, your augments, your units, and your items are very important to have a good reroll spot. Specifically, if you're talking about quote-unquote good reroll spots, if we split them up per cost, like I said, this is similar to the other video that I presented, but more condensed. If you're playing a 1-cost reroll, so you're trying to hit a 3-star 1-cost, you want to have, at least 2+ copies of that unit on stage 2. You want to have a large amount of that unit because you are going to need to hit that unit very early. So if you don't have copies of the unit, chances are you don't have a good spot for it. Additionally, you want to have most your necessary items by the end of stage 2. So by the time you reach Krugs, or when you cash out your components on Krugs, you want to be able to itemize those units, because if you don't have items for those units and it's Krugs, you're in a really bad spot because you will not be able to properly allow those units to either tank or do damage within your stage 3. And often when you're playing 1-cost, you want to have your 3-star early on stage 3, because that just plays into the power spikes that you want to have playing around those low cost units. 2-cost units, similar idea. You want to have multiple copies, 2+ copies of that unit on stage 2 before you commit to it. You want to have those copies on stage 2 because typically with rerolls, you're going to be committing a lot earlier based on what units you're holding. You're sacrificing econ based on when you're rolling. You're sacrificing econ. So you have to make those decisions early so that you don't just grief your econ and then have to use that econ to play some later comp afterwards. You just won't be able to manage both. You also want to have necessary items by the end of stage 2, because obviously if you're committing to a low cost unit, that's really essential. The difference between 2-cost and 1-cost units, however, is that usually you want to have a 2-star early on stage 3, and then you want to hit your 3-star stage 4. You're not expected to hit your 3-star as early because obviously it's more expensive. You have to level up usually to level 6 for your 2-cost and then hit a little bit later. You just want to have the 2-star on stage 3 because similarly you want to invest some gold into your board so that you keep an HP advantage that allows you to have the time to hit that 3-star and then win out from there. You don't want to be losing on stage 3 when you're playing a 2-cost. 3-cost rerolls, sorry it's getting a bit condensed, I just want to fit it all on one slide. But 3-costs, similarly, if you're ever committing to a reroll, you always want to have multiple copies of the unit on stage 2 in order to be in a good spot. If you do not have copies of the unit, or if you have only one copy of the unit, it can be very difficult to hit those final copies of the unit later. Typically with the 3-cost unit, you want to have the 2-star early on stage 3 to keep with the trend of playing reroll, keeping an HP advantage, and being strong early in the game in order to maintain that HP advantage. Additionally, you want to have most of your necessary items at the by stage 3 because that's when you're gonna like complete your board, and you want to have your 3-star late stage 4. Earlier the better, obviously, but that's typically what you're aiming for. So when we talk about rerolls and we talk about stability, when you're stabilizing around a reroll, a lot of times 2-stars are going to be stable. With 1-cost rerolls in particular, you'll often want to have the 3-star on stage 3 in order to have a great deal of stability. Most of the necessary items you want to have at the end of stage 2, like I said, if you have your units and you don't have items for them, then they won't do anything. You need to have items on your units, or else they just sit there and they look pretty and they don't do any damage and they don't do any tanking. Additionally, you want to have your 3-stars early stage 3. That's just like the main thing with 1-cost rerolls. 2 and 3-cost rerolls, however, you're not expected to hit your 3-star so early, so a lot of times you're looking for stability by hitting the 2-stars with items on stage 2. So you want to find that stability point. That's why you want to have multiple copies of them early on in stage 2, because you want to increase your chance of hitting that 2-star as early as possible. With 2-costs and 3-costs, you're usually going to be on a 2-star for a very long time, so the sooner you hit that stabilization point, the sooner you will have that power spike that allows you to get an HP lead that will then give you the time in the game to hit the rest of your units. Additionally, you want to have your 3-stars around stage 4, stage 5 in order to convert to your top 4. One thing that's really important that I always have to tell people This is something that's important for your line selection when you're choosing to play a particular comp. If a reroll is not stable with 2 stars, it is a particular and risky line. This means it requires better items, better HP, better everything. If you are playing a reroll that you have a 2-star and you are still losing majority of the rounds, no matter what stage it is, then that reroll line needs something else in order to be stable. And if it needs something else to be stable, it is likely a bad comp that is very particular. This is very applicable to a lot of lines that, might look really appealing at certain points in the game, but you have to understand that, that's just something that, you need to have that in your brain always. And that's, a lot with your line selection. Otherwise, you're just playing a weak comp that doesn't technically work very well. So let's go through some examples. So let's go some good and bad Mundo spots and good and bad Grave spots. Sorry about the extra Q there. So let's talk about a Mundo spot, right? If we're playing on stage 2 for example, the Mundo would involve obviously hitting these units. These are the main units that you're trying to 3-star usually. Usually it's Mundo 3-star, and then it's Seraphine and Zyra 3-star. If I have one copy of all of these units, I do not think this is a good reroll spot, because basically you're going to be really far away from those stabilization points. Because you're going for multiple 3-stars, a lot of times you want to have at least one 3-star early on stage 3, so you want to start the game off with a couple copies of each of the units. Ideally, if you're starting the game off with a Mundo 2-star for example, and maybe another unit 2-starred, this would be a lot better of a reroll spot. Additionally, if you have items for those units, so typically with Mundo you want to have a Warmogs, you either want to have a belt as a spare component. Let me just find a useless unit here. For your spare components, you want to start the game off with a belt component. You want to give yourself the greatest chance of being able to make one of Mundo's best items, which is Warmogs. Additionally, you might want to have AP items, right? Having an early Rod would make a lot of sense because it will make a lot of different Zyra items or Seraphine items or even Mundo items. It just gives you the potential to play around AP a little bit easier. This is just a very vague and general example. Of course, if you don't have items that support these units particularly well, for example, if you're starting the game off with these units and instead you have a glove and a sword, this is a lot more risky because this comp really requires Mundo to have good tank items. If you're starting the game out without good tank items, you also don't have necessarily the best items that you can make with Zyra. Of course, this can be half of Shojin, this can be half of Jewel Gauntlet, but you're too far away from any items. I would say this spot is a lot riskier whether or not you have the units. These are the types of things that have to go into your decision making when you're committing to a certain reroll line. The items that you have matter a lot because you have to hit those items early because, imagine Krugs doesn't drop that many components. If your components aren't particularly good, so it's you start off like this and you don't get good components, then you go to Krugs and you get another useless component. Let's say you get a bow and you get a chainmail or something. I'm just using Morganas as holders of components here, right? If you don't get dropped good components, it doesn't matter if you have a 3-star unit, you're still going to be in a bad spot. When you're committing to early rerolls like this, you need to have a mixture of both the strong units that you want to reroll as well as the items for those units. If you do not have both of them, you're in a bad spot and you cannot commit to that line in any particular way. Additionally, let's consider a 2-cost reroll like Graves, for example. Graves, having a single copy of Graves often can indicate that you can play around Graves pretty easily because Graves is really strong on stage 2 as a 1-star unit. Additionally, like I said, you want to have good items. If I start the game off and I have a tear and a bow, yes, you can make a Hodge, you can make something with this, but these aren't items that are necessarily going to be good on the Graves. With Graves especially, you want to start the game off with at least a glove, because a lot of times you're going for QSS, which is really important. You can go QSS Hodge, you can go QSS Guardbreaker in some cases, but a lot of times you're going for Sterix QSS. If you're not starting the game off with either these items or components that lead into these items, it doesn't matter if you have a Graves, your chances of hitting stability are going to be a lot less because if you don't have the right items, you can easily lose out later. Additionally, if you're starting the game off with a 2-star unit, this is going to be what you're going to be playing for majority of the game, right? For all of stage 2 and most of stage 3, you're not just going to teleport it instantly have a Graves 3 next turn. A lot of times you're going to be starting out with a Graves 2. That's going to be the unit that you're playing for a very long period of time. So having 2 stars early, especially with 2 cost, usually puts you in a really good spot to play around those units. So next, that's talking about rerolls. Rerolls are very obvious, I think, with the spots, especially. Like, if you're playing a reroll line, it's like, hey, do I have units? Do I have items? Yes. Okay, I can play around this reroll. Usually those lines feel like they're very obvious. So 4 costs is where things get a little bit more complicated. So hopefully you're bearing with me, and now we're going to get into the 4 costs. Start with the easy one. Now this one's where it's going to get a little bit more complicated. Since you're going for 4 costs, you're usually playing around something that you don't have yet. You're playing around something that is coming in the distant future of the game. So the way that you analyze if you have a good spot to play a 4 cost comp is not the same as how you would analyze for a reroll line. Instead, you have to think about what are the potential stabilization points for that 4 cost comp in the future, and what do I need in order to reach those things in the future. So a lot of times with 4 cost, you need to have strong econ. You need the econ to both level to play the 4 cost, to find the 4 cost to have better odds. You're trying to go to level 8, sometimes level 9, and you also need to have the gold for rolling for those units. Additionally, you have to have good HP management. Depending on which 4 cost line you pick, you need to manage your HP in such a way that you actually make it to level 8. High HP can be really necessary. Some 4 cost lines lack stability, especially if you don't find a copy of the unit, which could happen in some encounters where you don't have good econ, don't have good HP management. Additionally, if you have low HP, that also could be okay because some of the 4 cost comps have really high caps. A lot of the more risky and powerful lines are usually tied to the higher cost units, 4 costs and 5 costs. Reroll lines are known for their ability to stabilize early because you are spending your gold early, which causes you to have a stronger board. Remember TFT 101, if I have a high board value by spending all my gold early, I will be stronger than most people at that particular point in the game. 4 costs, they have a little bit more of a sway potential of win outs because of the fact that you're investing in a comp later. They're usually the higher cap comps. Additionally, you also need good augments, obviously, to support your 4 costs. If we're talking about good 4 cost comps, however, good 4 cost spots, however, a lot of times things matter if you make it to those points of stabilization for the units. So additionally, when you're playing a 4 cost comp, it is not just a 4 cost and nothing else. The other units that are on the board that help compose the board matter a lot. So a lot of times, if you have upgraded low cost units that would make it to the final board, that's going to help your spot be a lot better. Additionally, having good items for those 4 cost lines obviously is going to help you play around that 4 cost line. Certain comps also have specific conditions, which we will talk about in like a slide or two. So having the specific conditions for the comp will also help you have a better spot around playing the 4 costs. Additionally, you have to understand the comp placement. So typically with reroll, I already said it's like you play early game, you get super stable. It's not necessarily a win out, but you're playing around an HP advantage all the time. 4-star comps aren't necessarily like that. You're not necessarily, unless you're high roll, playing with the largest of HP advantages. So you have to decide what kind of comp you're playing. If you're playing a win out comp, you have to prioritize the econ in order to hit the units that allow you to win out and then win. So there are certain comps that they're very risky unless you hit certain things. Additionally, if you're playing a low cap comp, like sometimes there's 4 cost comps that you're just playing for a top 4, then you need the HP to secure the placement. Because if you're going to get out capped by somebody else, you cannot just commit to a line that is not very strong if you don't have much HP to work with. So a lot of times you're trading HP to have more econ because you know you're lose streaking, gaining more econ, getting a better spot for the particular comp. If you're losing HP, you want to play one of the win out comps. If you have a lot of HP, then you can decide either or. You can go for a win out comp, but often you can, if you don't think that you have a particularly good spot to win out, you can then play towards the secure placement and sacrifice your HP to just bleed out to a top 4. 4 cost stability is something that's a little bit more hard to deal with, right? A lot of times, finding one copy of the 4 costs that you need is where you find stability. Is not necessarily finding a 2-star version of the unit. You cannot guarantee hit a 2-star version of a 4 cost. It requires a lot of gold and it's typically very high roll. A lot of times what you're looking for is just one copy of that 4 cost, either one copy of the tank or one copy of the backline, and then reevaluate your board and resend it later. But that's what you're initially looking for on your first roll down. Additionally, the other thing that's often overlooked with stability is upgrading all your low cost units. All the other units that are on your board, you want them to be upgraded because these are the inexpensive units that don't take too much. That's going to help your stability a lot in most cases. If a 4 cost line is not stable with 1 stars. It is particular and often risky. This is similar to what I was talking about with the reroll lines. You would require better items, better HP, better everything. And there are many 4-cost lines that are like this, which is why it's very important to understand how the comp stabilizes and what the stability needs are for the particular comp. Now, let's go through some examples. I think this is where everybody wants to see some stuff. So we're going to do a couple examples here. First, we're going to talk about Zeri. So let's talk about Exotech, because this one is one of the comps that is very easy to stabilize around because it has a lot to work with. It has a lot of stability in the fact that its low-cost units are very valuable in providing a bunch of HP. When you're playing around the Zeri comp, there are a couple things that make this comp super stable. You get a lot more stability if you have good Exotech items. Your Exotech items typically have to be ones that work well on the units that are your key carries and your key tanks. So for example, if you're playing around Zeri, the better Zeri items are typically going to be Pulse Stabilizer or the Flux Capacitor. I think this is Flux Capacitor, but typically the better one is just Pulse Stabilizer. So Pulse Stabilizer, let's just go for best here. And the tank items are typically all the ones that aren't Cyber Coil. So for example, Corrupted Chassis or Repulsor Lanterns are pretty good. But let's just say Corrupted Chassis, right? If you have good Exotech items that work well with your board, that's going to be a point towards stability for this comp. Additionally, you want to play around 7 Exotech, so what you're looking for is 1 copy of Sejuani, 1 copy of Zeri. Your items also have to be particularly good. Usually with Zeri, because you get a lot of attack speed, I think the priority is always Krakens and then Guinsoo, but this is what people usually do. I actually don't like it that much. I think the Guinsoo is kind of useless, so I actually prefer to, like, if I have Pulse Stabilizer especially, to go for like something like this, and I think you just do more damage on average, just because like you get a lot of base attack speed from Exotech. So the Guinsoo to me is a little bit whatever, but it's fine. You can make Guinsoo. I'm not saying don't make Guinsoo. You can do whatever you want. So I'll just put this here to appease the people, because I think this is the common way that people play Zeri. But either way, when you're playing around Exotech, one point of stability that is really important is Mordekaiser 2 as well. Upgrading Mordekaiser as well as all of these other units matters a lot. Jin and Varus both do a lot of damage, so even with a 1-star Zeri, you can find a lot of stability by having these other units upgraded. Additionally, Mordekaiser a lot of the times is the main tank. So yes, Sejuani is the 4-cost, but Mordekaiser in general works a lot better with the Exotech items and generally tends to tank a lot more than the Sejuani. Sejuani is really good because she gets the stun off, obviously, but having the upgraded Mordekaiser and putting tank items on Mordekaiser often helps out this board a lot more. And additionally, having all of these other units helps you quite a bit because they all have a bunch of HP if you start stacking extra items on them via Exotech. So if I'm looking at this board and I'm trying to decide if I have a good spot to play it, a lot of times I want an early game that leans itself towards having these necessary conditions. So even before I have a Zeri or a Sejuani, a lot of times my Exotech spot's going to be better if I have good Exotech items. If I have those good Exotech items, I know that I have the ability to play around Exotech, which is going to help me later when I eventually decide to play Exotech. Additionally, if I start the game off and I have early copies or upgrades of these units, these are units that are going to make it to the final board that I play. I'm going to be playing 5 Exotech, I'm going to be playing Jax, I'm going to be playing Mordekaiser. So if I start the game off and I have an upgraded Mordekaiser, I have upgraded Jax, that's going to make me decide, hey, my spot for Exotech is a lot better, I will play towards Exotech. Combine it with good items that I can then manage in a way that makes sense, then I would consider I have a good spot for this particular comp. Exotech is also super stable with the 7 Exotech just having the HP lead or having the HP on your board, so you can play it from both an HP lead or even an HP deficit because it does have a good chance of just being extremely dominant and stable on stage 4 by just hitting the copies of the units, right? Which isn't that expensive, right? You're just looking for 1-star copies of them because there's a lot of stability in the remainder of the units on your board. Let's compare that to something like Brand, right? So there's lots of different variations of Brand, but let's talk about Street Demon Brand, for example. The thing about Street Demon Brand, it usually looks like this. Let's just assume you don't hit the Samira, and then you're playing your Ziggs, right? This is another level 8 comp, but this one's a lot more particular than something like Exotech Zeri, because these units typically don't do that well, right? Mundo can tank quite a bit, but he's not super tanky without Bruiser activated. Something like Echo is not super tanky, he just doesn't work very well as a frontline unit. And Rengar, he's more of a damage dealer, he's also not a tank. So basically your front line, a lot of times when you're playing around Street Demon, if you're playing Brand, AP line, I know this is a less popular line, but I'm going to explain why a little bit, you're really reliant on this Nico to be your main tank. Nico 1 is okay, you could find stability with Nico 1, but if you're going up against a lot of boards that have good augments, good damage, good front lines, you're actually going to lack the necessary tankiness without a Nico 2. This is what I would call a comp that you want to be very particular. You want to be uncontested, you want to have nobody playing the same comp as you have to have really good items, and you have to have really good econ because you're not going for just a 1-star version similar to Exotech, you're going for a 2-star Nico because if you don't upgrade, even if you upgrade these other units, a lot of times you're going to be lacking the necessary front line without the Nico 2. Additionally, if you look at Brand and Ziggs, they also don't have really good single target damage. They are really good at doing massive, huge AoE damage. So if you don't have Brand 2 and you don't have Ziggs 2, it also makes this comp not do too well, especially against really tanky boards, something like Zeri, something like Vanguard Marksman, something like other boards that have 5 costs. This is why a comp like this is not one that you necessarily want to commit to or play unless you know that you're uncontested and you have a really good spot for it. If you have good augments that support the Street Demons, if you have early copies of these units, early upgrades, this is something you want to play with more of an HP advantage in order to make the spot better, because there's a chance that you're not stable if you find 1-star versions of these units, and otherwise you might just bleed out and have a really rough time. Next, playing from ahead versus playing from behind. So a lot of times there's some comps that require HP because they often lack stability on stage 4. This is really common with a lot of 4-cost comps because there are some comps where if you play them from ahead, you typically can do a lot better as long as you can make it to level 9, because they're really reliant on hitting those huge power spikes with the 5 cost. These are typically considered to be fast 9 comps, but you can also play them on stage 4, but they just lack stability at those points in time. So some examples of those. Brand is one of them, but Brand is just in general like a little bit of an awkward comp because AP isn't in the greatest spot right now. One example of a comp that I wanted to talk about was MF, or Dynamo MF. So Dynamo as a comp is something you could play on level 8. A lot of times it will look something like this, right? You will play around your Dynamo units. Typically these, if you can't find Aurora, swap it out with your next favorite Dynamo unit, which is usually Jhin. And a lot of times you end up playing a front line that looks something like this. Now there are many different variations of this comp, but I'm just going to focus on this one for sake of example because it is one that's popular and it's basically playing around MF as a main carry. MF recently got buffed. Dynamo is pretty strong and I think there could be a lot of success with this comp. But if you look at this board, this is a board that lacks some stability on level 8. Why is that? Well, if you look at the front line here, we're playing around all low cost units. So having, excuse me, I want to put it as a 2-star. Having, sorry, it's freaking out. So having them upgraded is useful, yes. Having a spot to play this comp is useful, yes. You could have an early game that's indicative of playing around these particular units, right? You can start the game off with really good MF items. You can even start the game off with an early MF. You can start the game off with an Elise 2-star where you have good Elise items, right? Like if we're talking about this comp, there's lots of things you can do playing early game that can lead you into wanting to play this on a level 8. However, the biggest problem is that your front line isn't one cohesive solid unit, right? You basically have 2 Bruiser and 2 Vanguard. What would be better for this Braum? A lot of times it would probably be to play 4 Vanguard. What would be better for your Bruisers? It would be better to play 4 Bruisers. You want to buff and stack the ability for that unit to tank, because basically these extra synergies you're getting, they're often not considered to be particularly useful for that one particular unit. Here we're just making it so it lights up the left side of our screen, for example. Additionally, even if we were playing 4 Vanguard, right, let's say we drop the Bruisers, we lose Syndicate bonus, which might be a problem, especially if our MF is our main carry. But either way, what ends up happening a lot of the times is that this board's going to have a lot of trouble sustaining the front line against other comps that have really, really reliable front lines. So for example, if I go full board here, and I go on the opposite side, and let's say the opposite side is playing Exotech. Well, Exotech, we already established, is going to be getting a lot of HP because of all of its Exotech units. It's going to be hard to crack through the Exotech board with such a small and frail front line. Additionally, you might be playing something like Vanguard Marksmans, right? Where you're playing around Leona, Zaya, Aphelios, like here, we'll just put a couple of the units over here, right? If you're playing deep into the Vanguard synergy, this is also going to have a really strong and reliable front line where you won't be able to crack it very easily. So when I look at the MF board, it's not a board that you can necessarily say to yourself, oh yes, this is an MF game. We're going to easily play MF this game. It's something that requires you to play a little bit from ahead because you're probably going to lose some rounds on stage 4 just because of lack of front line, maybe lack of single target, high damage potential. A lot of times if you're stuck on level 8, you can try and roll for 3 stars, and that might make the board work out really well, make it like into a reroll style comp. But most of the time, this board is going to suffer against some of the other 4-cost lines because of its lack of stability, typically in the front line. There are remedies for this. Obviously, you can play, you can play 4 Bruiser or 4 Vanguard, or play something that's more cohesive as a front line. But typically, what this board does is you basically find yourself maybe stable, maybe not stable, but you find yourself in a spot where you can play around that board. You lose a little bit of HP, but not too much HP, right? You're still not going to be super stable, but in some lobbies you will be. But then what you're trying to do is use this to tempo yourself to a board that then plays into a lot of 5 costs. What ends up usually happening is you'll play a board that ends up looking like this with a Gragas usually, right? This is a level 9 board. This board is astronomically better. You're basically playing around multiple 5-cost frontline units that then make this one of the strongest, highest cap boards in the game. So a lot of times, if you have the HP lead, playing around these units is going to put you in such a spot where, you're going to hit Aurora 2, you're going to itemize the Aurora, you can do massive, massive damage, and have a huge high cap potential with this comp. These are the riskier comps that typically you would commit to, only given certain situations that allow you to reach those high cap potentials. A lot of times, like that's what I was talking about when you have like a comp that has a win out potential. This is an example of a comp that has a win out potential given you have enough money and econ in order to hit all of your units. Additionally, let's say you don't have a high win out potential, right? So in this case, right, like let's say we're thinking about our MF items. Let's put MF back, and we have something like this as our opener, right? And I'm looking for Braum. Right? Something like this makes sense to play something that's maybe more low cap. If we don't have the HP and the stability in order to make it to a high cap level, that's why sometimes you'll play a lower cap version of a board. You can play a similar board that uses similar items, which would just be the Vanguard Marksman board, right? The Vanguard Marksman board, usually it's 6 Vanguard. Let me just find the other Vanguard units to make it look a little bit more complete. I need one more. Right? You can similarly find stability in these lower cap boards. So a lot of times when you're committing to a particular comp or deciding what line to play, a lot of it depends on a lot of external factors. Not only what comps people are playing, not only what comps you have a spot for, but also your own HP and your own management of your own resources, right? The amount of times that you should be playing with these type of items, Vanguard Marksman versus something like Dynamo MF, usually is going to lean more towards the Vanguard Marksmans because you need so much gold and so much HP in order to fully realize the potential of the Dynamo comp that you might be playing more of like a 1st or 8th more temperamental style, which is totally fine if you want to do that, but that's what I'm trying to get at as an illustrative point here, right? So then a lot of times you want to think about when do you want to commit to a certain comp. So I'm giving you examples of different comps that we're playing at different points in the game. I'm talking a lot about end game boards. Let's go back a little bit and talk about back on our stage 2, stage 3, our early game when we're thinking about the 4 costs. A lot of times you want to play around your opening units, your opening items, and your opening augments on stage 2. You can commit to a comp on stage 2, but often this is very risky. That's like you take a stage 2 spat via augment, stage 2 augment that commits you to a particular line. A lot of times you're going to play around low cost units. They're going to be something like this, excuse me. Everybody knows this. This is like a common thing that happens in your opener. You get Vanguards, you get Boombot in, you get Rapid Fire in, you play around Kog'Maw, you make a Guinsoo, you make whatever you want to call it, you make a Kraken, and we're good to go, right? This is like a normal situation you have on stage 2. What you do is you build a front line that has 2 synergies, you build a back line that has a synergy, you put them together, you call it a day. That's your stage 2. And a lot of times, based on whatever units you have, you make items that make sense with those units. So whether it be AD or AP, whether it be a unit that auto attacks a lot or a unit that does massive damage off rip, a lot of times you're going to take something like this, you're going to make your items, and then you'll worry about it a little bit later. You just want to make sure that you're playing your stage 2 to the best of your ability, or you're just committing to a lose streak, one or the other. But if you're trying to, like, preserve HP, give yourself a good chance, maximize your econ gains, you typically just try and construct a board, see how it goes, try your best. That's usually what stage 2 is. Now, obviously, I can commit from stage 2 to Boombot. I can commit to stage 2 for Vanguard Marksman. I can commit stage 2 to Zeri, but typically you're not going to do that. You're just going to play around your opener, play your items, and then what you normally want to do is commit on early stage 3, right? You don't want to commit on stage 2 unless you have a very obvious and good spot for a particular comp. Like, obviously if I start the game off and I have, like, 2 stars of the low cost units that are going to make it to final board, this might be an indication to play towards a particular line. If I have an augment that really enables a certain comp, then I can commit towards a particular line. But typically you're going to wait until early stage 3 before you fully commit to your line. And the main reason for that is you want to keep your pivot options open. Here, there are many different routes I can go with this, right? I can play towards Zeri. These items are fine on Zeri. I can play towards Kog'Maw Reroll. These lines are fine with Kog'Maw Reroll. I can play towards Aphelios. These lines are good with Aphelios, right? All of these make sense, but it comes down to the conditions that I hit later on. Do I have good Exotech items? Then maybe play Zeri. Do I have upgraded Exotech units towards, like, when I hit to stage 4? Then maybe play around Zeri. Do I have more Vanguards? Maybe play around Aphelios. Is it more contested to play Zeri because everybody wants to play Zeri? Then maybe I'll play Aphelios. Do I have a lot of HP? Yes or no? If I don't have a lot of HP, maybe I should just play one of the more consistent lines. Do I have infinite resources where I have infinite Kog'Maws and a bunch of duplicators? Then maybe I'll just commit to Kog'Maw here. There's different options that come up, and usually you want to give yourself a little bit of time. Not too much time where you're trying to play everything, but when you talk about flexible play, think about what items and what your opener can lead into. AD is really obvious because there are a lot of AD units that use similar items. We just listed Zeri and Aphelios, right? There is also Xayah and MF that share very similar items. If you're building Xayah items, they're pretty much the same items you would put on an MF. You have options between figuring out which units you want to commit to later, but a lot of it comes down to how did my stage 2 go, what's my HP, what's my conditions for the success of each comp, right? Do I have a lot of HP? Then am I win streaking? Am I just steamrolling everybody? Then maybe it's an MF commit because it's a really high cap comp. Am I not winning a lot of rounds? Do I have low HP? Am I going to be in a bad spot where I need to play something that is really stable and really reliable and I'm going to be stuck on level 8 rolling to 0? Then maybe we commit towards Xayah. Do you see the ideas that I'm trying to plant here? Right? It's often wrong. This is one of the main things that you should always know. You don't want to commit early to a weak comp. There are comps that just suck. They are just weak. You don't want to start your game off, see one Fiddlesticks, right? And say to yourself, you know what this is? This is a Fiddlesticks reroll game. And you just commit instantly Archangels and you say, I'm playing Fiddlesticks off this one Fiddlesticks and nothing else. It's like, this is already a comp that is very weak. It's very hard to stabilize with. It's very bad into a lot of the comps that are super stable late in the game. You don't want to just instantly start your game off and commit towards a weak comp via by augment, via by items, via by the units that you're holding. You want to always commit to comps, or at least decide to play comps that have enough of a potential to top 4, not necessarily just commit to something that's, like, really weak, right? So example, obviously Fiddlesticks. I gave the example with MF and the other ones. Let's just pick another style of opener that we might want to commit to. Let's say we're playing around, I'm trying to pick up like an AP line, for example. This, and this, and you, right? Let's think about potential lines we can play, right? We can play, Morgana Reroll. Is that particularly strong? Maybe, maybe not. Let's say we start off with a blue buff. Blue buff is great because we have lots of different options here. There's many different lines that we can play from an opener like this. Obviously, if we have a blue buff already, or if we have, like, let's just say blue buff Gunblade. This makes it really easy just for me as an example, right? There are a couple lines, right? We can play towards Dynamo, right? We can play Elise Dynamo from this opener, just win streak and play. If we have huge HP leads, we might want to play Dynamo because we have a really high cap potential if we can hit the Aurora and all the later Dynamo units. So obviously we can commit and play around Dynamo in this case. However, do we have good Exotech items? If our Exotech items make sense for Vex, which we have the necessary conditions for Vex, we can then lean into the Exotech side of things. That's a comp that will stabilize a lot more easily because of the Exotech units that are on the board. This is the type of thing you should always think about. You should always have your plan A, your plan B, and then decide to commit based on what you have and what you can hit. Additionally, now let's cover two last topics. Contesting, right? Sometimes you play a game and somebody has the same spot as you to play a similar comp, and you end up contesting each other. What does that mean for you? Well, when you're playing a contested comp, you want to contest from the better spot, right? You want to have items, econ, HP units. You will stabilize harder given you have the better spot for the comp. So do you have the units? Do you have the items? Do you have the econ that make the comp shine? If that is the case, then often it makes sense for you to continue with your game plan of playing around the same comp. Do not pivot if pivoting will result in a worse placement, and also never contest a weak comp. This is a huge question mark, and I see it happen all the time, even in my own games that I'm playing. If somebody is playing Brand, don't go into the game and say, I'm also going to play Brand. It's like, it's clearly a comp that does not support multiple people because it's hard to stabilize with it. So you want to be careful about that, right? If a comp is strong, you can contest it and still be stable. We talked about Zeri, for example. Zeri is strong as long as you upgrade the low cost units, which isn't hard to do, and you have one copy of each of the units, you often find stability. That means that you can often play it while being contested, and both of you will still have an okay or reasonable time going for a top 4. However, you obviously want to be playing it from the better spot. If you have more HP, items, econ, units, then you will be in a better spot to actually realize the top 4, and it won't just be RNG of who hits and who doesn't hit. There are many times where I play around Zeri, for example, and another person has a Zeri 2 and a Sejuani 2, and I still outplace them with Zeri 1 and Sejuani 1 just because my items and my econ and my augments are better for the comp. You have to always keep that in mind, right? It's not just a matter of like planting your flag and saying, I play the comp that I want to play. You want to make sure that the spot that you have for the comp is good and has the necessary conditions for that particular comp. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm going to let you guys be because this video is already a little bit longer. We're actually going to do another video that's related to this topic tomorrow that kind of goes into a little bit more detail. And then also, in a day or two, I think as soon as I get around to it, I'm going to be playing with my mom and maybe trying to teach her TFT. So that's gonna be a nice for fun content that I hope you guys really like and enjoy, because I'm putting a lot of effort into it. I'm trying to hook up and set up a mic for her, and I'm getting my room all cleaned up so that we have 2 spots to sit. And I'm gonna try and teach her, somebody who has never played TFT before, for your own viewing pleasure and entertainment, because she agreed to do it. So look forward to that. It should be out on the weekend as soon as we get around to playing. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and see ya. Bye bye.